Hi ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another video lecture. Today we're going to be taking a look at China post-Mao and a little bit more of the modern history associated with China. So we'll kind of pick up where we kind of talked, or at least left off a little bit this week. We've covered the Civil War, we've covered the beginnings of the communist regime in China, and we've talked a little bit about the Cultural Revolution and kind of Mao's run of power. So we'll kind of pick up towards Mao's death in the 1970s and try to bring you guys at least a little bit towards the future of what's going on in this part of the world today. So first off, let's do a quick little overview of kind of what China looked like after Mao's death. And kind of similarly to what we saw with Russia in the aftermath of the Communist Revolution and in the aftermath of kind of glasnost and perestroika with the Soviet Union, you have a society that really is in need of a new direction. So Mao's Cultural Revolution was widely considered a failure. It didn't really achieve the goal that Mao wanted, per se. It kind of, created an era of just distrust and kind of tiredness when it came to the communist cause. And so you have many in China who want to try to go about on a new path. They want to try to move away from the kind of the history of the 60s and 70s that brought the Cultural Revolution. And they want to try to modernize, bring in more technology, have a more modern economy. And to a certain extent, this idea of Western anti-imperialism, this idea that the West is out to get us, is going to start to melt away. And this idea of more openness with the West, and especially the United States, is going to be something that both U.S. foreign policy is going to emphasize, and there are going to be varying motivations for why that is. But also this idea that trade and economically speaking, a better relationship with the West can be beneficial. So we've talked in previous lessons about the cult of personality that developed around Chairman Mao with his little red book, kind of following the lead of Stalin with the heavy-duty editing, heavy-duty usage of secret police and kind of removing political opponents literally from the memory of the public. The institution of kind of the Chinese version of the Gulag, these reform camps where basically political prisoners and political critics would be sent here and they would basically learn through hard peasant labor how to become good communists again, the removing by the Red Guard of anything unrevolutionary, books, materials, art, all of this destroyed, and obviously, opponents, teachers, intellectuals going through the struggle sessions and being punished. Now, the beginnings of change you could even somewhat equate to Mao himself. And granted, we don't really know how much Mao was with it by the end of his life. He was starting to suffer from dementia, and he had a host of other medical issues that were kind of making him less and less of a public figure. But some of you guys might remember from your US2 classes in 1972, Richard Nixon becomes the guy who kind of breaks the Great Wall, so to speak. He becomes the first US president to visit Communist China, and really the first Western leader to visit Communist China, and opens this dialogue with the Chinese that we are still kind of cultivating today. And so part of Nixon's reason for doing this was kind of to use China as leverage against the Soviet Union, since the relationship between the communists in China and the communists in the Soviet Union had never been great. But for the Chinese, this was a way to sort of begin in Western investment, to kind of change their image a little bit, and to also begin kind of this period of more openness. So we can kind of equate this a little bit to Mao, and then obviously Mao is going to die in 1976, his body put on display. We've covered this with most communist regimes, that they have this tendency of mummifying and preserving their founders. But who takes over after Mao is going to be equally interesting and probably both good and bad for the future of China. So the guy who takes over for Mao within these inter-party elections and eventually is going to become the new leader of the communist power is Deng Xiaoping. And Xiaoping is a guy who was a follower of Mao's during the Civil War. He was of the old guard, but he was also a guy who was not afraid to speak out against the hardliners who had put in place the Cultural Revolution. He had actually been a critic of the Cultural Revolution, and because of his standing with the chairman, had not been a victim of the struggle sessions or any of the stuff that some of his contemporaries faced. When he consolidates power in China, he's going to bring about a program known as the Four Modernizations. And the Four Modernizations were basically economic ideas to upgrade the economy and allow for more influence of Western investment, but also investment in Western ideas. Now, we're not saying we want democracy or popular elections or anything like that, but China is willing to allow Western styles of education, of art, of different elements like that to now start make their way in to try to make China appear more progressive, more modern, and less kind of totalitarian, since they have this new relationship with the West cultivated first by President Nixon and then later by other world leaders. Xiaoping is an interesting guy. We know he grew up a peasant. We know his family was not of a particularly high class in China. We know that he serves in World War II with Mao's communist forces, and then later gets involved with the Communist Party during the Civil War. We know as a political leader he became very, very important to Mao's regime, and we know that when he takes power himself as the new kind of leader of China, he continues to cultivate this good relationship with the United States, and you can see the numerous U.S. presidents that he cultivates that relationship with. In the 1980s, he goes after the Gang of Four, probably most prominently Mao's widow, and basically prosecutes them for all the stuff they did during the Cultural Revolution, kind of bringing this period in Chinese history to an end. And then he begins his own kind of political path with the four modernizations. Now, I'll kind of take you guys through each of what these four modernizations were all about. They were very specifically focused on economic topics, but also social topics as well. So the first modernization is agriculture. Agriculture has always been at the forefront of China's economy. So the idea of getting the peasants out of the factories and sort of back to work with the land, making sure famines like what had happened during the Great Leap Forward don't happen over again. That was something that was really prominent to this new communist regime. Special economic zones, also known as the second modernization industry, the idea of rebooting China's attempt to modernize and industrialize. This idea that we're going to create these special economic zones in key cities, and you can see a map of those zones there. And we're basically going to allow these cities to kind of blossom and become economic hubs, really focus on heavy industries here, while the rest of China, kind of the western provinces, can go back to kind of the tradition of farming and agriculture. The third modernization, national defense, modernizing the Chinese army, bringing it up to code, eliminating the Red Guard as kind of the focal point of national defense, and really creating kind of a modern military, kind of as what we think of today, at least by the standards of the time. And then, of course, science and technology, the final modernization, the idea that China will start advance now, they'll start to become more progressive, more of a focus on science and education and technical education, and the idea that China has some catching up to do. The prevailing image after the Cultural Revolution was that China was backwards, it was out of the way, it was just not doing what it needed to do to be a progressive modern state. So Xiaoping is going to try to address this by putting a bigger emphasis on the idea of technology and innovation. Now, this is not in any way different than what Stalin was trying to do in the aftermath of the Civil War and his grab for power. The idea of the 5-year plan in many ways kind of mirrors this, but where it's a little different is that we actually see a concerted effort not to necessarily stop Western ideas. While I will make the argument that Xiaoping did have a cult of personality, they did try to cultivate a little of that Maoist image. It wasn't as overt. You still have secret police forces. We're still talking about a dictatorship here. But it wasn't as heavy-handed as what it had been under Mao, and it was definitely not as heavy-handed as it was under Stalin. People had a level of freedom where they could speak out, but obviously don't speak out too much. So a little bit of a difference there. Now, the big question here, of course, becomes, was everyone happy with these types of reforms? Well, the easy answer to that is not everybody. There were some communist leaders who were still very fearful of Western influences. Some of the old guard were fearful that if we let in too much of this Western idea, it's going to start to become like what we saw later on with the Soviet Union in the 1980s and 90s, that you give a little bit and eventually the Chinese populace is going to demand more freedom, more freedom, more freedom, and eventually communism will cease to exist, like what we saw with the Soviet Union and Gorbachev and Perestroika and Glasnost. So what China has is basically a youth movement, and the youth, as they start to get a taste of these new freedoms, they start to really, really want more, want more, want more. And this is going to culminate in 1989 with the Tiananmen Square protest, a series of protests that are going to take place in Beijing, the capital. And initially, this starts off as a hunger strike by a group of local art students. And inevitably, it starts to get bigger. It starts to get bigger. It starts to get bigger. It includes not just students, but just what we would call probably blue-collar folk, working folk, peasants come in and take part in this. And it really becomes kind of a social movement. The focus of this initial protest was to try to fight against a lack of political freedom within China when it came to censorship, free speech, the ability to publish newspapers, and bring up issues that the youth cared about. Inevitably, there's going to be a series of negotiations but unfortunately those negotiations break down for a variety of reasons, which we'll talk just really briefly about here. And when the negotiations fell apart, Yao Ping uses martial law. He uses Chinese troops to break this up because, again, there's always this specter of a counter-revolution in the minds of a lot of Chinese leaders. We don't know how big the crowds got. Some of the estimates put it at over 1 million people at one point were crammed into this kind of main area that the protest was happening in, which was Tiananmen Square, one of the main squares of Beijing. And as far as the injuries and fatalities, again, the Chinese government never released official records, so we just have estimates, and you can see those estimates on the screen. So here's kind of the epicenter of this protest, which is Tiananmen Square. It's where Mao's mausoleum is. It's where the Forbidden City is. So there's a focal point of history here as well. If you look at the slide up at the top, you can see those light posts. You can also see their cameras. The Chinese government today, this is probably one of the most heavily scrutinized squares in China, and it's mainly because of the legacy of Tiananmen Square protest that the Chinese are paranoid always of counter-revolutions. So you go to China today, there's cameras everywhere, there's firewalls, there's a suppression of information, mainly because after Tiananmen Square, the Chinese become very paranoid of that, and they suddenly realize that, you know, a Soviet Union-style breakdown could happen here, and so we have to control that. The protests begin mainly because one of the big supporters, one of the big reformers that was with the youth movement, passes away from the Chinese Politburo. Yao Bang was a reformer. He was a guy who wanted more political freedom, who wanted more openness in Chinese society. When he dies, his reforms are going to be picked up by the protesters, and they're going to take to the streets. They're going to kind of begin this as a hunger strike in Tiananmen Square, and slowly it's going to grow and it's going to become more elaborate, where basically you have a giant sit-in, and the protests just keep growing. They keep growing. The students adopt symbols of their anger and their protests, and this is one of my favorite symbols from the whole thing. The Chinese government, during their negotiations, agreed to provide food, water, and showers to the protesters, and those showers included bars of soap. So a group of art students that were among the protesters basically took the soap and didn't use it for what they were supposed to do. They created a sculpture, and it became the goddess of democracy, and they modeled it after the Statue of Liberty. So that became one of the symbols of this protest. Now, when the military goes in, the statue is going to be destroyed immediately because obviously, again, the Chinese are very fearful that these symbols become the beginning of a counter-revolution. So the negotiations go on. For the most part, there is a peaceful coexistence between the military and the people because the military don't want to fire on their own citizens. And everything is done kind of openly. For the most part, foreign journalists kind of watch these proceedings and kind of keep an eye on it, and that allows to keep this whole thing a little bit honest in the eyes of the Chinese. So the decision to use force, though, comes because some of the hardliners within the Communist Party tells Yao Ping that this is the beginning of a revolution, so you got to address it, you got to crush it. And so they basically clamp down on the foreign journalists, cover this, though we do have some of the journalists at great risk to their own lives, you know, sneak out on their hotel balconies and kind of take video or take footage of this whole thing as it unfolds. And basically the military goes in and they're basically told to clear the streets. And probably one of the most iconic photographs of this thing is what we get with Tank Man. We have no idea who this man is. We have no idea what became of him. We simply know that this man took it upon himself to stand in the street and kind of block the approach of these Chinese tanks while some of the protesters tried to get out of the square. He held them as long as he could. If you watch the footage that's out there of this, at one point you have Chinese security police grabbing him and taking him away. And we assume they're Chinese security police. We don't know who they are. They could have been protesters or just average people. But Tank Man, basically, we don't know who he is. We don't know, what his story was. He just is one of these crazy footnotes in the story of Tiananmen Square. And from there, we have escalating violence. And again, we'll probably never know the true level of the fatalities, but the camps are destroyed, the square is cleared, and this kind of brings about a new government crackdown on dissidents within China, which China is still working with today. And like I said, if you go to Tiananmen Square, it's still a big tourist attraction, but it's heavily focused on when it comes to the Chinese intelligence services and their military. As we start to get into modern China, other elements of the four modernizations that are going to be adopted by the Chinese is an attempt to control their population. A lot of you guys I know are familiar with this policy, which was recently kind of amended and eventually repealed by the Chinese, I think last year. The one-child policy, population control measure, which limits a family to having one child and one child alone. Now, there are exceptions to this, and we'll talk about some of those exceptions. The goals of this program were pretty simple. They want to encourage marriage later and childbirth to be later. Now, part of this is using biology kind of against the family, because the later you get, the more chances are that you're going to be unable to have children or have, difficulty with pregnancy. So by delaying marriage, there's an attempt there to try to discourage having large families. Fewer babies, healthier babies, hence the one-child portion of this. The idea to focus all your resources on making one child healthy rather than having, 6 children that may have, multiple health concerns because you don't have enough resources to do that. And then that idea of the one child. And usually there would be an emphasis on a boy because in Chinese culture, the boy obviously, inherits the family property, but also the name rights. And this is also popular in Western culture. The name rights continue as well. And so we actually, if you look at the demographics from this period that the one-child policy was really, really at its height, you see that we're having more boys born than girls, and so there was fear later on that the Chinese were creating kind of this imbalance. Why was the policy created? Very simply, it was a population control measure. China was concerned that their land was not going to be able to support over 1 billion people, so the idea of preserving resources was really paramount, especially for a communist society that provides health care to all, that provides a certain level of protection for all. The idea was we just don't have enough, so we gotta take steps now to limit that. So if you disobeyed the policy, how would that work? Well, usually there would be fines, there would be a loss of state medical benefits, there might even be jail time. This is not unusual with states that have kind of put in place population control measures. Where it kind of gets into the realm of issues with human rights is if you had repeat offenders, there would oftentimes be terminations of pregnancies, basically state abortions, or forced sterilizations for both men and women if they were repeat offenders. So that's where the UN kind of raised some concerns about human rights. And obviously extra children are going to be put up for adoption. That's one of the reasons why if you go into an adoption agency today, a lot of the children that are up, especially if you go foreign adoption, there's a discussion of would you accept a Chinese child? And a lot of times it's a girl. Kind of dates back to the unfortunate legacy of this act. The Chinese government today really feels that even though they've relaxed elements of it, they have actually done a good thing. They claim they prevented close to 4 million new births, and that's actually 4 million less citizens that they have to worry about in terms of food, clothing, public utilities, that kind of thing. But obviously outside groups, Western groups have criticized this as well. The breaking up of families, the kind of the poor methods by which some of the medical procedures are done, and also kind of the discrimination that occurs. And a lot of times we find this there are other ethnic groups. The Han Chinese, which is the majority of the culture, usually don't get as severe punishment as like the Buddhist minority or the Muslim minority or some of the other minority groups that live in China. To bring this into kind of a more modern sense as well, China has gone through a period of economic growth, but they've also had bumps along the way. And obviously you guys will get more into that in your gov classes, but obviously China is going through kind of their version of the Industrial Revolution, and they're having the same issues that Europe and the United States had when they went through their industrial revolutions, probably none more prominent than the pollution, because China is a predominantly coal-fired economy, and like we saw in the 19th century with England, coal's a dirty form of fuel, and it's affecting the Chinese population, and it's soon now starting to reach out into a more global setting. The issue of human rights remains a problem, particularly when you talk about ethnic minorities in China and how much rights they receive under the communist regime. Limits, obviously, on civil liberties like speech is kind of the unfortunate legacy of Tiananmen Square. It continues to be a problem for China. They don't really approve of any type of dissidence or kind of counterpoint to the official party mantra. Some of you guys may know there have been some popular guys like the artist Wally, who has definitely been sort of a main spokesperson against that. He's been attacked by secret police. He's been exiled from the country, yet he remains probably one of the more prominent critics of the communist regime through his art. Some of you guys may know the story of kind of the Chinese occupation of Tibet. China took Tibet in the 1950s as part of their territory, but since then there has been kind of this unofficial war on the Tibetan populations in Tibet. Calls that they have violated religious rights, human rights, different things like that. And obviously the Dalai Lama is a world leader that the Chinese do not recognize. They consider him a subversive, and so he actually doesn't live in Tibet. He actually lives in India and continues to kind of promote the idea of Tibetan independence even today. The return of Hong Kong, obviously given back by the British, has always been a focal point because Hong Kong grows up with an element of democracy and an economy all their own that's separate from the Chinese. And when it was returned to China, there was this idea that Hong Kong would have a certain level of autonomy. That has been both good and bad because the Chinese want to reap the benefits of this port, but they can't because there's a different culture there. There's a different government style there. And so if any of you guys followed the Umbrella Uprising in recent years, this was attempts to try to keep the Chinese from interfering in local elections there. And basically just, when the people of Hong Kong rose up and protested this, you have the Chinese coming in with tear gas and different things. And so the umbrellas, kind of became a symbol of that as folks tried to move through the tear gas, protecting themselves from being gassed and harmed in that way. Some of you may know about the Great Firewall, this attempt to try to censor information in China further. And obviously the biggest concern the United States has recently is China expanding their military reach out into the South China Sea. Now this is areas that were typically seen as international waters or waters that were seen as being part of Vietnam or the Philippines or other areas. The Chinese are basically taking these small little kind of quasi-islands, building them up, putting military bases on them. And there's a question of, are they creating kind of their own version of coaling stations, their own little kind of strategic military bases similar to what the United States did in the 19th century, what the Japanese tried to do during World War II, and could this provoke war either with Vietnam, with the Philippines, or even with the United States? To take a look at current Chinese leaders, after Deng Xiaoping, we had Jiang Zemin, and he kind of took China into the 21st century. Very good working relationship with Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. And then we got Hu Jintao, who then took over for him, and mostly under his watch we had discussions of the national debt and kind of what that would look like and kind of the growing fear of that. Current president of China, Xi Jinping, and again I apologize for my Chinese pronunciation here. Also a guy who's seen as a bit of a hardliner. Good working relationship with the West, wants to encourage Western investment and get it flowing again, but also a guy that definitely has a little of that old school anti-corruption, anti-dissident mentality. So to kind of wrap this up, future of China, it's going to be interesting. We have issues of debt and finance, which obviously you'll get more into in your gov classes. International business and sort of the way China's economy continues to grow, both good and bad, continues to be problematic. Reforms such as human rights, but also where China sits in the world. If you remember, Mao promised to turn China into a global power. And some historians think that China has now reached that. They're emerging now finally as a global power for the first time since the Middle Ages. What's that going to look like in the future? What does it mean to the United States? All of that is still open questions to be determined. We hope you guys enjoyed this video lecture. If you have any questions, feel free to check out the slides of this presentation again, which the link we'll put up on Classroom, and we'll see you guys again next time.